time to see what was going on, and there's this flapping noise. Bang, 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 bang. The bastards are firing at us.
John Story made it to the roof of the building he'd escaped to.
On the next roof, there was two guys shooting at the helicopter going across. And then I remember just putting the gun on automatic, so I thought I wouldn't get one chance at this. And they fell down.
There was an enormous bang like a bomb going off, and a bullet came up through the right-hand chin window of the helicopter, and it took my right kneecap off. The whole helicopter just spun round on its axis. While it was doing that, I sent out a mayday call. Mayday, 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 chopper Zulu 44 has been shot down over Temple Cliffs. And there was a slight pause, and the air traffic controller said, chopper Zulu 44, roger, out. I thought, well, he could have sounded a bit more concerned, you know. I looked down, and we were coming vertically down, and we were about 50 feet off the ground. And we came down like that, and came out like that, and splat, hit the ground.
Colonel Mitchell took a helicopter ride himself to observe the scene.
He saw below him what must have been the bodies in the street and these burning Land Rovers. And he wasn't in charge, so it was very frustrating. And it was terrible to see 3 Argylls killed that you couldn't go and do anything about. I suppose in many ways that was a spur to what happened later.
The only survivor, John Story, was desperate to escape, but was spotted and shot at by the armed police.
I thought, if they're coming after me, I'll jump off the roof, just kill myself. That's what I thought. I'll just do a swan dive off the top of a 6-storey block of flats. I'd resigned to it anyway. I suppose you just accept what's going to happen. And then, I suppose anger probably takes over. So you don't become afraid, you just say, to hell with it.
The patrol that had initially reported trouble had made it safely out of Crater. They were ordered back in to see what had happened to the Land Rovers. It was the last time they were seen alive. Days later, their mutilated, burnt bodies would be returned in boxes.
The intention was to wipe the smile off the British faces, so they wouldn't leave feeling victorious, just as they made our people suffer when they occupied the south of our country.
If it's a straightforward shot, dead, well, so be it, you know. But to torture them into the bargain by people who were giving you a mug of tea the day before, that's even worse, you know. Oh, it doesn't happen rightly. It makes you angry even yet, you know, when you heard the way they were dealt with, the way they had to die.
Colin Mitchell would like to have gone in and got the bodies out straight away, and anybody else who might still have been there, and done something about it. It dominated the situation, but we didn't dominate it. We were flung out of Crater. There was the heart of Aden in the hands of mutinous armed policemen and terrorists. And that was the area we'd come to look after, so it was very frustrating.
Terrified the Arab police would catch him, John Story was desperate for a place to hide and took a family hostage in their flat.
I'd used the last of my ammunition, the last half dozen rounds or whatever, on the roof to kill the other 2 guys on the roof. The rest of the day was a bluff. I remember asking him for a drink of water. He gave me a bottle of water. I made him drink it first. I was so paranoid. You know, it was strange. Then about 2 o'clock, the armoured cars started coming in.
Nigel Stevens had been sent into Crater in his armoured vehicle.
We drove up here, and coming up we saw the Land Rovers here with bodies all around them. It was a real shock, and we were under heavy machine gun. Further along as well, there were machine guns on the armed police barracks at this end, and there were machine guns at the far end. I stopped my armoured car just a little top end of this crossroads here. We didn't know that there was a survivor from the original ambush of the 2 Land Rovers, who must have been machine gunned from this side here. And I understand now that Fusilier Story managed to get to that building there.
I did feel isolated. When I was in the flats, I was making plans to try and get out of that situation. I was thinking maybe I could wear a dress and get off with the crowd. All crazy things were going through my mind. And I thought, yeah, with a big pair of army boots, and all the bodies were still there, but the armoured cars were going past, but they had the turrets open. The bullets were going inside the armoured cars and rattling around the side.
Every time somebody appeared, I fired at them with my driver's submachine gun. Asked for permission to use a main armament because I knew there were machine guns firing at us, and the only way I could have knocked them out was with a main armament. It was a difficult situation to be left in. I do remember calling up on the radio, said, "Can I have an answer? Is somebody going to answer my question? Can I use my main armament?" I probably asked 2 or 3 times. I was told to wait. It was a critical decision, absolutely. We waited here until we were eventually ordered just to get away. And we drove up through Main Pass, drove again up the dual carriageway. We barged one of the buses out of the way and drove out to the top, where we waited. And we waited. And then we were told not to go back in again.
I suppose I prayed to God and said, "Get me out of this, and I'll go to church every Sunday or something." I suppose you turn to God when you're just about to die, don't you?
The British soldiers were confined to manning roadblocks at the 2 entrances to Crater, much to the anger of Colonel Mitchell and the Argylls.
The decision not to go in and rescue the bodies, and indeed not to use the heavy weapons of the armoured cars which we had, it was pretty shameful.
It was extremely galling at the time that the British Army weren't able to get out their wounded and their dead, and just left them. Crater became a no-go area for British troops for weeks. Political expediency, I think it's called, isn't it?
The British government felt that if you shot an Arab terrorist, that was provocative and was going to make the situation worse, and it might have repercussions anywhere else in Aden.
Alone in Crater and with no prospect of rescue by the British, John Story was being hunted down. He jumped 60 feet out of the window to escape the armed police hammering on the door outside.
Looked back the direction I'd come in, there was people hanging out the blocks of flats shouting, pointing to where I was, obviously shouting he's down there. But then I got into a corner and I got trapped.
Outside of Crater, Middle East Command continued to follow orders from Whitehall not to go in. Snipers were sent up to the ridge.
When we first went up, we were actually looking down on the bodies of the soldiers that had been killed. So, anger and frustration there at not being able to get your own men off the ground was terrible.
To a man, we all volunteered to the company commander that we wanted to get back in there. We wanted to go in there and put a counter-attack in personally. And between the military and the politicians, there was a big no, no, no. It was a strict order, you will not re-enter Crater. And it was on my mind that any member of the regiment who was down there would be expecting us to go in there. That's something we've had to live with.
While the British were forced to wait on the rim of Crater, the Arab police had captured John Story.
They started putting all the bodies back into a big wagon, police wagon, 3-ton wagon, and they put me in the front seat, me being the only one alive. So I'm sat in the vehicle and I thought, this is it. Because everything was narrow, everybody was shouting and screaming and going berserk. And when I asked the wagon driver what was happening, he said the crowd want to kill you. It was like somebody waved a magic wand. One minute there's a mass murderous crowd with guns wanting your blood, and next minute the street's deserted and you're sat in the wagon by yourself and everybody's crouching near walls.
British snipers on the ridge opened fire on the Arabs in Crater. Middle East Command did not stop them. For the rest of the day, Crater became a killing zone.
They just fired indiscriminately, all for the best part of maybe 4 or 5 hours. And of course, by the time the soldiers were put onto the rim, they all knew how our men died. So that was all taken into account. The machine gun barrels were white hot, and I was supplying the ammunition. It was a wild day,
John's story made it to safety with the help of some Arab police who now regretted their actions, his colleagues for a further 24 hours. The Arab nationalists now claimed victory in Crater.
We were pleased that the British left and we got rid of them, and our own government would take over.
News of events in Crater was filtering out to relatives in England. John Moncur was one of those killed in the ambush. The army informed his wife.
I opened the door and he said, "Anne, I'm terribly sorry, I've got bad news for you." And I said, "Everybody had left just after I'd been told, and everything was quiet." And I did go and sit on the floor by them. And then when they woke up the following morning, I said Daddy wasn't coming home. And I said he wouldn't be coming home.
Colin did go to the mortuary to identify the bodies, and it must have been an incredibly sad moment to see one of his star company commanders and two quite splendid jocks killed when they weren't even operating under his command. And I dare say it had a psychological effect.
I got shot through the arm. I thought if I stay, I won't have a chance.
You asked me what the worst moment in Aden was. When I was in hospital, everybody was bringing me cigarettes, and I'd stopped smoking for 7 weeks. Prior to that, obviously I started smoking again. That's the worst thing.
With 9 of their men killed, 5 days after the mutiny, the Northumberland Fusiliers returned home.
I couldn't get my head round that we were leaving with Crater in the state that it was in, unoccupied, the first time probably since Aden was occupied itself, and we left a bit more than thieves in the night.
John's death, to me, was the worst thing, was just not having him anymore. He was no longer there. And coming to terms with that was huge. He just wasn't there anymore. And it's hard to believe. And you just have to start, coming to terms with that. Yeah.
The 22 British soldiers...
Crater and what happened in the other line. 22 British soldiers killed that day. That was a humiliation, really, and not being allowed to do anything about it. That's what really hurt.
I was very upset about the murder of British troops by the Arab police in Aden, but this was just another sign of how unpopular foreign occupation is, and the Americans are discovering this in Iraq at this moment.
The day of the funeral, Colonel Colin Mitchell and the Argylls took over control of Crater, which was still in Arab hands.
But I personally regarded the circumstances of the 20th of June as utterly disgraceful. I felt myself that we had actually abandoned the place under the most terrible and tragic circumstances to a lot of sort of third-rate, fly-blown chaps. It seemed to me incredibly bad.
Colonel Mitchell was absolutely determined that he wanted revenge, that he would go in and avenge the death of his and other soldiers. But the question was, would Britain let him? The Whitehall establishment, they didn't want Mitch to take any aggressive action because they were frightened that it would provoke an uprising and make withdrawal difficult and impossible, and certainly not peaceful. So the big question was, what's going to happen?
We thought it was not only morally wrong to kill people without a proper reason, but secondly, it would be politically disastrous and economically and militarily very costly, because the more people you kill, the more terrorists, the more opponents you create.
An impasse ensued as the British government deliberated whether it was worth retaking Crater in the few months left before the official withdrawal from Aden. Snipers waited on the ridges overlooking Crater.
That was very, very, very frustrating. We were biting at the leash. We were dying to get in there, and we were hoping we'd get in there. As soon as Mad Mitch says, "Let's go, boys," we were all behind him.
While some British soldiers fired at anyone who aroused suspicion, evacuations of British civilians accelerated. With Crater in Arab hands, it seemed the end of empire in Aden was on the brink of an early collapse. the British had to turn to undercover forces for help.